When I asked my son when his wedding would be, my daughter-in-law smiled and said, "We got married yesterday, only special people were there. For 3 years, I paid their rent, their bills, their dreams. But I wasn't special." That night, I opened my checkbook, and every number stared back like a scar. They called it love. I called it a receipt. When they tried to take my home, my name, my sanity, I stopped being the quiet mother they could ignore. This is the story of Ruth Miller, a woman who lost her family's love, but found something stronger, self-respect. If you're watching this, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because sometimes standing up for yourself is the greatest act of love there is. The morning light filtered through Ruth Miller's kitchen window in soft, pale streaks. She sat at her small wooden table, her fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. The coffee had grown cold 20 minutes ago, but she didn't notice. Ruth was 71. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a faded blue cardigan that had seen better decades. The fabric was thin at the elbows. Her hands showed liver spots and careful wrinkles. These were hands that had sorted medical bills for 37 years. Hands that counted every penny twice. The apartment was small but clean. Everything had its place. The furniture was old but well-maintained. A single photograph sat on the side table. It showed a younger Ruth with her late husband, Robert. He'd been gone for 6 years now. The house felt bigger without him, and quieter. Ruth reached for her phone. The black screen reflected her tired face. She took a breath and dialed. The number was programmed under Max, her son, her only child. "Hi, Mom." Max's voice sounded rushed. Background noise suggested he was driving. "Hello, sweetheart. I hope I'm not bothering you." No was, "It's fine." "What's up?" Ruth smiled despite herself. He always sounded busy. Always had somewhere to be. "I was wondering about the wedding date. You mentioned it might be this weekend, but I haven't heard anything specific." Silence stretched across the line. Then voices in the background. A woman's voice. "Lena, actually, Mom." Max's voice changed, became careful. "Hold on a second." Ruth heard muffled conversation. Then a different voice came on the line. Clear and cold. "Hi, Mrs. Miller. This is Lena." "Oh, hello, dear. How are you?" "I'm wonderful, thank you." Lena's voice carried a smile that didn't reach her words. "About the wedding? Well, we got married yesterday. We only invited special people." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. She felt her breath catch. The kitchen seemed to grow smaller around her. "Yesterday?" Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, it was intimate. Just close family and friends who really matter, you know?" Ruth's hand tightened on the phone. "I see. I hope you understand. We wanted to keep it small." The line went quiet except for the sound of Ruth's heartbeat in her ears. She looked across the room at her bedroom door. Behind it hung a pale pink dress, size 14. She'd bought it 3 months ago at Kohl's. $47.63, including tax. She'd saved for 2 weeks to afford it. The dress still had tags on it. "Mom, you there?" Max's voice was back on the line. "Yes, I'm here. I'll call you later, okay? We're kind of in the middle of something." "Of course. Congratulations." The line went dead. Ruth set the phone down with shaking hands. She stared at the blank screen for a long moment. Then she looked around her kitchen. Really looked at it. On the counter sat a stack of envelopes. Bills. The electric company. The pharmacy. Her insurance copay for the blood pressure medication. All overdue by at least 2 weeks. She'd been putting them off, choosing between her medication and Max's rent. Again. For 3 years, she'd written the same check every month. $500. Sometimes more when they needed groceries, or when the washing machine broke, or when Lena wanted new furniture for the living room, or when their air conditioner died last summer. Ruth walked to her bedroom. Her steps felt heavy on the worn carpet. She opened the closet door and touched the pink dress. The fabric was soft polyester. Nothing fancy. But it was new. And it was pretty. She'd imagined how she would look walking into the church. How proud she would feel. She'd practiced her smile in the mirror. Ruth returned to the kitchen and opened the drawer beside the sink. Inside was her checkbook. The register showed a balance of $347. Her Social Security check wouldn't arrive for another week. She sat down and flipped through the carbon copies of old checks. 500 to Max. 500 to Max. Sometimes 600 when they needed extra. The pattern went back 3 years. Month after month after month. Ruth calculated in her head. The skill came naturally after decades in hospital billing. 500 times 36 months. $18,000. Plus the extra payments. plus the furniture, plus the repair bills. She estimated $22,000, maybe more. $22,000 to people who didn't consider her special enough to attend their wedding. Ruth closed the checkbook and placed it on the table. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once and fell silent. She looked at her reflection in the dark phone screen. The same tired face looked back. But something in her eyes had changed. The softness was gone, replaced by something harder. Something that had been building for 3 years without her realizing it. Special people, she whispered to the empty room. The words felt strange in her mouth. Foreign. Like a language she'd never learned to speak. Ruth opened the checkbook again. This time, she wasn't looking at the checks she'd written. She was looking at the blank ones still remaining. About 15 left in the book. 15 chances to make different choices. The afternoon sun shifted across her kitchen table. It illuminated the unpaid bills, the cold coffee, the closed checkbook. Ruth Miller sat in the silence and began to plan. Ruth woke at 5:30 the next morning. Her body ached from sleeping poorly. But her mind was clear. She had work to do. She made coffee in the same chipped mug. This time she drank it while it was hot. The bitter taste helped her focus. She pulled out a yellow legal pad from the kitchen drawer, the kind she'd used for hospital billing. Precise. Organized. At the top of the first page, she wrote Max and Lena, total payments. Ruth opened her checkbook and began listing entries. May 2022, $500 for rent. June 2022, $500 for rent plus $200 for groceries. July 2022, $500 for rent plus $400 for a washer and dryer. Her handwriting was small and neat. Each entry included a date and amount. She worked steadily for 2 hours. The numbers grew longer. The pages filled up. When she finished, Ruth stared at the final total. $33,400. She wrote the number twice to be sure. Then she circled it in red ink. $33,000. More than half her annual income. More than Robert's funeral had cost. More than their first car. Ruth folded the legal pad and put it in her purse. She dressed carefully in her best navy suit. The one she'd worn to church with Robert? The fabric smelled faintly of his cologne. Old Spice. Even after 6 years. The bus ride to downtown Milwaukee took 40 minutes. Ruth watched the city pass through rain-streaked windows. Office buildings. Coffee shops. People walking fast with purpose. She felt like a stranger in her own life. First National Bank stood on the corner of Wisconsin Avenue. Ruth had banked there for 28 years. The lobby was marble and mahogany, quiet except for the sound of heels on stone. Mrs. Miller? A young man in a gray suit approached. I'm Mr. Klein. We spoke on the phone. Ruth shook his hand. His grip was firm but gentle. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Maybe 40 years old. About Max's age. Thank you for seeing me on short notice. Of course. Let's go to my office. Klein's office was small but professional. Family photos on the desk. A diploma from University of Wisconsin on the wall. He offered Ruth coffee. She declined. You mentioned wanting to review your automatic payments? Ruth opened her purse and pulled out the legal pad. She handed it to Klein without comment. His eyes moved down the columns of numbers. His expression grew serious. This is quite a lot of money, Mrs. Miller. Yes, it is. And you want to stop all automatic transfers to your son's account? Every one of them. Klein studied her face. Ruth kept her expression neutral. Professional. The way she looked at difficult doctors during billing disputes. Are you sure about this? Sometimes family financial arrangements can be complicated. I'm very sure. Klein nodded and turned to his computer. His fingers moved across the keyboard. Ruth watched the screen change. Numbers and codes she didn't understand. But she trusted him. Done. All automatic payments have been canceled. Your account is secure. What does that mean exactly? No one can access your money without your written authorization. And you can always change the settings later if needed. Ruth felt something loosen in her chest. Relief, maybe. Or something stronger. Thank you, Mr. Klein. You're welcome. Is there anything else I can help you with? Ruth considered telling him about yesterday. About special people in pale pink dresses. But she didn't. Some things were private. No, that's everything. The bus ride home felt different. Lighter somehow. Ruth watched the same buildings pass by. But now they looked familiar again. Like pieces of her own life. Her phone buzzed 3 times during the trip. Max's name appeared on the screen each time. Ruth let it ring. She had nothing to say to him yet. At home, Ruth made lunch. A simple sandwich and soup. She ate slowly at her kitchen table. The legal pad sat beside her plate. Evidence of 3 years she couldn't get back. The phone rang 4 more times that afternoon. Always Max. Ruth turned the volume down and continued reading her library book. A mystery novel about an elderly woman solving crimes. Fiction seemed easier than reality. By evening, the calls had stopped. Ruth assumed Max had given up. She was making tea when she heard voices outside. Car doors slamming. Footsteps on her front porch. The doorbell rang once. Then someone used a key. Ruth froze in her kitchen. She heard her front door open. Voices in her living room. Max's voice. Lena's laugh. And someone else. A stranger. Ruth walked to the living room doorway. 3 people stood around her coffee table. Max wore a dark suit. Lena had on a white dress. Expensive looking. The third person was an older man with gray hair and a briefcase. They were reading her mail. Bills and bank statements spread across the table like playing cards. Mom. Max looked up. His face was flushed. Embarrassed or angry? We need to talk. Ruth said nothing. She stayed in the doorway and watched them sort through her private papers. This is Mr. Harrison, Max continued. He's a family lawyer. We asked him to help us understand your situation. Harrison stepped forward. He had the smooth smile of someone who sold things for a living. Mrs. Miller, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your son is very concerned about your recent decisions. My decisions? The banking changes you made today. Max tells me you've been under some stress lately. Ruth looked at each of them in turn. Her son, his wife, the stranger with her personal information. They stood in her living room like they owned it. We're just worried about your judgment, Mom, Max said. His voice was gentle. The way doctors talk to confused patients. Maybe you need some help managing things. Harrison opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. I've prepared some documents that might make everyone feel better. Just temporary arrangements to ensure your financial security. He placed papers on the coffee table. Ruth could see the heading on the first page. Power of attorney. Legal words in small print. Signatures lines at the bottom. It's very simple, Harrison continued. This would allow Max to help you with banking and bills, just until you're feeling more like yourself. Ruth walked closer to the table. She picked up the papers and read the first paragraph. The language was dense, complicated, but she understood enough. If she signed, Max would control her money, her bank account, her social security checks, her life. Ruth folded the papers in half, then in half again. She walked to the kitchen and dropped them in the trash can. The sound of paper hitting plastic was loud in the quiet house. Get out of my house. Her voice was calm, steady, like a judge announcing a verdict. Mom, please, get out. Ruth stood by her front door and waited. Max looked at Lena. Lena looked at Harrison. Harrison packed his briefcase with quick, efficient movements. Mrs. Miller, perhaps we could discuss this another time, Harrison said. When emotions aren't running so high. Ruth opened the door wider. Cold evening air rushed into the house. It smelled like rain and car exhaust and freedom. There won't be another time. They filed past her without speaking. Max paused at the threshold. Mom, I'm trying to help you. No, you're not. Ruth closed the door behind them. She turned the deadbolt and put the chain in place. Then she walked to her living room window and watched their car disappear down the street. The house felt different now. Bigger, quieter, but not empty. Ruth breathed deeply for the first time in hours. The air tasted clean in her lungs. She gathered her scattered papers from the coffee table. Bank statements, bills, private things they had no right to read. She organized them into neat stacks and put them away. In the kitchen, Ruth made fresh tea. She sat at her table with the legal pad open beside her. $33,400. The number looked smaller now, less important. Outside, streetlights flickered on in the gathering darkness. Ruth's reflection appeared in the kitchen window. The same tired face. But the eyes were different again. Stronger. Independence felt terrifying and glorious at the same time. Ruth Miller sat in her quiet house and planned her next move. Ruth spent 3 days researching lawyers online. The public library's computer was slow but reliable. She printed pages about elder law attorneys in Milwaukee. The paper felt crisp between her fingers. Evidence of her determination. Attorney Daniel Weber's office was in a renovated warehouse downtown. The building smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Ruth climbed 2 flights of stairs to save the elevator fee. Her knees protested, but she ignored them. Weber was younger than she'd expected. Maybe 50. He wore a simple blue shirt with rolled sleeves. Not rien uniforme. His office was cluttered with case files and coffee cups. A photograph of 2 golden retrievers sat on his desk. Mrs. Miller, please have a seat. Tell me what's happening. Ruth opened her purse and pulled out the legal pad. The pages were worn from handling. She'd memorized every number, but the evidence still mattered. My son and daughter-in-law took $33,000 from me over 3 years. Yesterday, they tried to get me to sign over power of attorney. Weber listened without interrupting. He took notes on a yellow pad identical to hers. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked directly at her. Mrs. Miller, what you're describing is elder financial abuse. It's more common than people think, and it's often perpetrated by family members. The words hit Ruth like cold water. Abuse. Yes, financial exploitation of vulnerable adults is a serious crime in Wisconsin. The fact that they brought a lawyer to pressure you into signing documents makes it worse. Ruth felt something shift inside her chest. Validation. After 3 years of doubt and guilt, someone was calling it what it was. What can I do? Weber leaned forward. We're going to protect you. First, we'll change your locks and install security cameras. Then we'll update your will and move your accounts to a different bank. And we'll document everything in case we need legal action later. Ruth felt tears building behind her eyes. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were relief. How much will this cost? My retainer is $1,500. But I work with a lot of seniors, Mrs. Miller. We'll figure out a payment plan that works. Ruth wrote the check without hesitation. $1,500 to protect $33,000. The math was simple. 3 days later, a locksmith named Garcia installed new deadbolts on Ruth's front and back doors. He was efficient and polite. He tested each lock twice and gave Ruth 4 copies of each key. The metal felt solid in her palm. The security camera installer came the next morning. 2 cameras outside, 1 in the living room. Ruth watched him position the equipment with careful precision. She could monitor everything from her phone now. Technology that had once intimidated her now felt like armor. Weber called that afternoon with an update. Your new account is ready at Community Trust Bank. Your Social Security will be direct deposited there starting next month. And I've drafted a new will that specifically excludes anyone who has exploited you financially. Ruth thanked him and hung up. She felt lighter with each protective measure. Like layers of vulnerability were being peeled away. The phone rang an hour later. Lena's name appeared on the screen. Ruth hesitated, then answered. Hi, Mrs. Miller. It's Lena. I know who it is. I wanted to apologize for the other night. Max feels terrible about how things went. We just worry about you, you know? Lena's voice was honey-sweet, concerned. Ruth recognized the manipulation now. Weber had taught her to listen for it. What do you want, Lena? Well, we're in a tight spot this month. The rent is due tomorrow, and we're a little short. Could you help us out, just this once? Ruth almost laughed. Just this once. After 3 years of just this once. No, Mrs. Miller, please. We'll pay you back as soon as Max gets his bonus. I promise. No, Lena, but we've always been there for you. When you were lonely after Mr. Miller died, we kept you company. We included you in our lives. The guilt hit Ruth like a familiar punch. She'd heard these arguments hundreds of times. They always worked before, but not today. Goodbye, Lena. Ruth hung up and turned off her phone. She made tea and sat in her quiet kitchen. The silence felt different now, protective instead of empty. The text messages started the next morning. Ruth read them while eating breakfast. Mom, please call me. We need to talk. From Max. I can't believe you're being so cruel. From Lena. Dad would be ashamed of how you're treating his son. From Lena again. Ruth deleted each message without responding, but the words stung, especially the last one. Robert had loved Max deeply, but Robert had also taught her to stand up for herself. More messages arrived throughout the day, some pleading, some angry, some trying to make her feel guilty about everything from Max's childhood to their wedding. Ruth turned off her phone and went to the library. She checked out 3 mystery novels and spent the afternoon reading in the park. The October air was crisp and clean. Children played on swings nearby. Their laughter felt like music. When Ruth returned home at sunset, a white car was parked in her driveway. Official looking. Government plates. A woman in a gray suit stood on Ruth's front porch. She was middle-aged with kind eyes and a clipboard. She knocked as Ruth approached. Mrs. Miller? I'm Sandra Chen from the Department of Social Services. We received a report of concern about your welfare. Ruth felt her stomach drop. A report? Someone called our office saying you might be confused or unable to care for yourself. I'm here to do a wellness check. Ruth unlocked her front door with steady hands. Please come in. Chen followed her into the living room. Ruth watched the social worker take note of the clean furniture, organized books, and fresh flowers on the coffee table. Everything in its proper place. Mrs. Miller, how are you feeling today? I'm feeling very well, thank you. Have you been having any trouble with memory or decision-making lately? No, I haven't. Chen asked more questions about Ruth's medications, her daily routine, her financial management. Ruth answered each one clearly and directly. Mrs. Miller, your home is well maintained, and you seem perfectly capable of self-care. Can you think of any reason someone might be concerned about your judgment? Ruth considered her options. She could mention Max and Lena, the $33,000, the power of attorney attempt, but something told her to be careful. I recently made some changes to my banking arrangements. Perhaps that concerns someone. What kind of changes? I canceled some automatic payments, and I hired a lawyer to help me organize my affairs. Chen made notes on her clipboard. That sounds very responsible. May I have your lawyer's contact information? Ruth gave her Weber's card. Chen called his office from Ruth's kitchen. The conversation was brief and professional. Mrs. Miller. Mr. Weber confirms that you've been working with him on estate planning. He says you're one of his most organized clients. Relief flooded through Ruth's body. So there's no problem. None that I can see. Whoever called us was mistaken or misinformed. I'll close this case today. Chen left her business card and headed for the door. Take care of yourself, Mrs. Miller. And feel free to call if you ever need assistance. Ruth watched the white car disappear down her street. Then she called Weber's office. They tried to have me declared incompetent. I'm not surprised. It's a common tactic when financial abuse is exposed. They probably thought a social services investigation would pressure you to restore their access. What happens now? Now we document this incident. False reports to social services can be considered harassment. We're building a case, Mrs. Miller. Ruth hung up feeling both violated and vindicated. Max and Lena had crossed a line she hadn't expected them to cross. But their plan had failed. That evening, Ruth sat in her living room with a new mystery novel. The house felt different again, smaller but stronger, like a fortress instead of a prison. Her phone remained off. The guilt messages could wait. The demands for money could wait. The fake concern could wait. Ruth Miller was learning the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness meant missing people who never really cared. Solitude meant protecting herself from people who would hurt her. For the first time in 3 years, she was choosing solitude. And it felt like freedom. Outside, streetlights flickered on in the October darkness. Ruth's reflection appeared in the window. The same face as always, but the eyes held something new. Strength without apology. The legal documents arrived on a Tuesday morning. Ruth found the thick manila envelope wedged between her storm door and front door. Her name was typed across the front in official block letters. Cook County Court System. Legal Service Division. Ruth carried the envelope to her kitchen table. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it. The paper inside was heavy. Official. The letterhead bore the seal of Illinois State Court. Petition for appointment of guardian for an alleged disabled person. Ruth read the words twice. Then she saw her own name listed under respondent. The person who allegedly needed a guardian. The person who allegedly couldn't take care of herself. Max Miller and Lena Calloway Miller were listed as petitioners. They sought to be appointed as her legal guardians because Ruth Miller was incompetent to manage her finances and personal affairs. Ruth set the papers down and walked to her window. Outside, Mrs. Henderson from next door was watering her flowers. She looked up and waved. Ruth didn't wave back. Mrs. Henderson was listed as a witness in the petition. Ruth returned to the kitchen and continued reading. The document claimed she had shown erratic behavior and poor judgment in financial matters. It mentioned her recent banking changes as evidence of confusion. It cited concerns from medical professionals about her mental state. Dr. Martinez from the clinic was listed as a supporting witness. Ruth had seen him twice for blood pressure medication. He barely knew her name. The pharmacist at Walgreens was also listed. A young man who had questioned her when she bought a generic version of her prescription instead of the brand name. Ruth had explained she was trying to save money. Apparently, he'd interpreted this as confusion. Ruth's hands trembled as she turned the pages, but her mind remained crystal clear. She understood exactly what was happening. Max and Lena were trying to steal her independence through the legal system. She called Weber's office immediately. They filed for guardianship, Ruth said when he answered. I was expecting this. Can you bring the petition to my office this afternoon? Ruth took the bus downtown. Weber's office felt like a sanctuary now, familiar and safe. He read through the petition with professional calm. His expression grew darker with each page. This is thin, Weber said finally. Very thin. They're claiming you're incompetent based on hearsay and mischaracterizations. What do? We fight it, and we win. Weber opened a fresh file folder. First, we're going to gather evidence that proves your competency. Bank records showing responsible financial management. Camera footage demonstrating normal daily activities. Character witnesses who can testify to your mental sharpness. Ruth felt hope stirring in her chest. What else? You'll need to undergo a complete psychiatric evaluation. I know it seems invasive, but we want an independent medical professional to certify your mental competency. Ruth nodded. She'd submit to any test necessary. Her mind was her strongest asset now. Weber made phone calls while Ruth waited. He spoke to doctors, court clerks, and expert witnesses. His voice was confident and professional. Ruth felt protected in a way she hadn't experienced since Robert died. The hearing is scheduled for next Friday, Weber said. That gives us 8 days to prepare our defense. Ruth spent the rest of the week gathering evidence. She organized 3 years of bank statements. She printed camera footage showing her normal daily routines. She collected character references from her former hospital colleagues, her pharmacist at the independent drugstore, and her longtime neighbors. The psychiatric evaluation took place on Thursday morning. Dr. Sarah Chen was a gentle woman in her 50s. She administered cognitive tests, memory assessments, and psychological interviews. Ruth answered every question clearly and completely. Mrs. Miller, your cognitive function is excellent, Doctor. Chen said afterward. Better than many people half your age. I see no evidence of dementia, confusion, or impaired judgment. Ruth felt vindicated, but also exhausted. Proving her sanity was emotionally draining in ways she hadn't expected. That night, Ruth sat in her living room with a cup of tea. The house felt too quiet, too empty. She thought about Max as a little boy, how he'd run to her when he scraped his knee, how she'd rocked him to sleep during thunderstorms. Now that same child was trying to have her declared incompetent. Ruth began to cry, deep, silent tears that came from somewhere beyond sadness. They were tears of grief for the relationship she'd lost, for the son who had become a stranger, for the mother she'd tried so hard to be. She cried for 10 minutes. Then she wiped her eyes and walked to her desk. Ruth opened a new composition notebook. On the cover, she wrote defense in clear block letters. Inside, she began planning her strategy for the hearing. She would tell the judge about the $33,000, about the power of attorney ambush, about the false social services report, about Max and Lena's pattern of manipulation and financial exploitation. Ruth wrote until midnight. Her handwriting was small and precise. Each fact was documented with dates and supporting evidence. She was building a case like she'd once built medical billing reports. Methodical and irrefutable. When she finished, Ruth set the notebook aside and went to her bedroom. She laid out her best Navy suit for the hearing, the one she'd worn to Weber's office, the one that made her feel professional and capable. Ruth woke before dawn on Friday morning. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with the notebook open. She rehearsed her testimony aloud in the empty house. Your Honor, I may be old, but I'm not blind. I see exactly what my son and daughter-in-law are trying to do. Her voice was steady, clear, strong. Ruth practiced for an hour. She anticipated the questions Weber had prepared her for. She rehearsed her responses until they sounded natural but authoritative. As the sun rose over Milwaukee, Ruth felt her fear transforming into something more useful. Strategy, determination, the righteous anger of someone who had been underestimated for too long. She dressed carefully in her Navy suit. She pinned Robert's small American flag pin to her lapel, a reminder of the values they'd shared. Honesty, hard work, standing up for what was right. Ruth looked at herself in the bedroom mirror. The same tired face as always. But the eyes held something new. Not just strength now, purpose. Today she would fight for her freedom, not just her money or her house, her right to make her own choices, her dignity as a human being. Ruth Miller picked up her defense notebook and headed for the door. The battle lines were drawn. She was ready for war. The morning air smelled like autumn leaves and possibility. Ruth breathed deeply and walked toward her future. Whatever that future held, it would be hers to decide. Ruth sat in her car outside the courthouse. The hearing was still 3 hours away. But she needed time to think, to remember, to understand how she had arrived at this moment. The morning sun warmed her face through the windshield. She closed her eyes and let the memories come. 1987, Robert's funeral. Smell of lilies and grief heavy in the chapel air. Max was 12 then, small for his age and scared. Ruth held his hand during the service. His palm was sweaty and cold. After the burial, people brought casseroles and sympathy. But bills didn't stop coming. The mortgage, the utilities, Max's school supplies and growing feet that needed new shoes every 3 months. Ruth took night shifts at the hospital billing office. She worked while Milwaukee slept. The office smelled like coffee and fluorescent lights. She processed insurance claims until dawn, then came home to get Max ready for school. She remembered sitting at the same kitchen table. Her homework spread on one side, Max's math worksheets on the other. She helped him with fractions while balancing their checkbook. His pencil eraser left pink crumbs on the table. Her calculator clicked softly in the quiet house. Money was always tight, but they managed. Ruth clipped coupons and bought generic brands. She mended Max's clothes instead of buying new ones. She taught him that things could be repaired, that nothing had to be thrown away. Max graduated high school with good grades. Ruth cried at the ceremony. Pride and exhaustion mixed together in the warm gymnasium air. She'd done it, raised a son alone, kept him safe and fed and educated. Then college, student loans and textbooks and dorm fees. Ruth worked extra shifts to help. She wanted Max to have opportunities she'd never had. She wanted his life to be easier than hers. After college came the phone calls. Always the same pattern. Hi, Mom. How are you? Then within minutes, Ruth remembered the first time clearly. Max had been 23. His car had broken down. $700 for repairs. Ruth sent the money without question. She was just happy he'd called. The pattern continued. Rent deposits, emergency room bills, credit card payments. Each time, Max promised to pay her back. Each time, Ruth told him not to worry about it. You're my son, she would say. That's what mothers do. But somewhere along the way, the calls stopped being about emergencies. Max called when he wanted a better apartment, when Lena wanted new furniture, when they decided to take a vacation. Ruth always said yes, because saying no felt like failing as a mother, because Max's disappointment was harder to bear than her own financial stress. She remembered the conversation that should have been a warning. 2 years ago, Max had called about the rent increase. Don't worry about paying me back, Mom. We're family. Everything you have will be ours anyway, right? Lena's voice in the background, laughing, agreeing. Ruth had felt something cold in her stomach that day, but she'd pushed the feeling away. She'd written the check and mailed it that afternoon. Now she understood what that feeling had been. Recognition. She was being used. Ruth opened her eyes and looked at the courthouse steps. Other people walked by with briefcases and serious expressions. Lives being decided by judges and lawyers and legal documents. She thought about Robert, how he'd taught Max to change a tire, to balance a checkbook, to take responsibility for his own mistakes. A man takes care of himself first, Robert used to say. Then he can take care of others. Ruth had forgotten that lesson after Robert died. She'd tried to be both parents, to provide and protect and fix everything. But in trying to make Max's life easier, she'd made him weaker. Real love meant teaching independence, not funding dependence. Ruth had purchased affection for $33,000. But purchased affection wasn't real affection. It was a transaction, a debt disguised as love. She forgave herself for being naive, for wanting to believe that generosity would create gratitude, for thinking that giving everything would make her indispensable. Ruth felt something lift from her shoulders, a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. The weight of trying to buy love from people who only saw her as a bank account. The courthouse clock chimed 10 times. Ruth gathered her purse and defense notebook. She walked up the stone steps with steady feet. The past was no longer a prison. It was proof, evidence of her strength and sacrifice and stubborn love. Today, she would use that proof to win her freedom. The courtroom smelled like old wood and nervous perspiration. Ruth sat beside Weber at the defendant's table. Her navy suit was pressed. Her hands were steady. The defense notebook lay open before her, filled with evidence and truth. Judge Patricia Holbrook entered through a side door. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes. Her black robes rustled as she took her seat behind the bench. The bailiff called the room to order. Max and Lena sat at the plaintiff's table with their lawyer, Harrison. Max wore his wedding suit. Lena had chosen a conservative dress that made her look younger. They'd planned their appearance as carefully as their lies. The court will hear testimony regarding the petition for guardianship, Judge Holbrook announced. Her voice carried through the small courtroom without effort. Harrison stood first. He called Dr. Martinez from the clinic. The doctor looked uncomfortable as he took the witness stand. His testimony was brief and uncertain. I saw Mrs. Miller twice for blood pressure medication. She seemed perhaps a bit confused about her insurance coverage. Weber cross-examined with precision. Doctor, did you conduct any cognitive assessments of Mrs. Miller? No. Did you observe any signs of dementia or mental impairment? Well, no, but she did seem worried about money. Being concerned about healthcare costs suggests mental impairment. Doctor, Martinez shifted in his chair. I suppose not. Weber then called Dr. Sarah Moore, the psychiatrist who had evaluated Ruth. Dr. Moore was confident and professional. She carried a thick folder of test results. Mrs. Miller's cognitive function tests scored in the 92nd percentile for her age group. Dr. Moore testified. Her memory, reasoning, and judgment are all excellent. I found no evidence of any mental impairment whatsoever. Harrison tried to undermine the testimony. But doctor, couldn't someone with early dementia still perform well on tests? These weren't simple tests, Mr. Harrison. I conducted a comprehensive 4-hour evaluation. Mrs. Miller demonstrated superior cognitive abilities throughout. Ruth watched the jury box, though there was no jury. Only Judge Holbrook taking careful notes. The judge's expression remained neutral, but Ruth sensed a tension shifting. Next came James Patterson, the pharmacist from Walgreens. He looked young and nervous. Harrison had called him as a witness to Ruth's confusion about medications. But Weber had done his homework. Mr. Patterson, I have your sworn affidavit here, Weber said, holding up a document. You state that Mrs. Miller's daughter-in-law, Lena Calloway Miller, contacted you about this case. Is that correct? Patterson's face flushed red. Yes, sir. And Ms. Calloway Miller suggested that Mrs. Miller's request for generic medications indicated mental confusion? She said her mother-in-law was acting strangely, not thinking clearly about money. But requesting generic medications to save money is actually quite rational, isn't it? Yes, it's very common. And smart. Weber introduced security camera footage on a laptop computer. The small screen showed Ruth's front porch and driveway. Date stamps marked each video segment. This footage shows repeated visits by the petitioners to Mrs. Miller's home, Weber narrated. Note the timestamps. October 15th, 3 p.m. October 16th, 10 a.m. October 17th, 7 p.m. The courtroom watched Max and Lena approach Ruth's door multiple times. On one video, Max used his key to enter without permission. On another, Lena peered through windows while Max knocked aggressively. The respondent had specifically asked them not to visit, Weber continued. This constitutes harassment and trespassing. Harrison objected, but Judge Holbrook overruled him. The evidence was clear and documented. Margaret Klein from Community Trust Bank testified next. She was middle-aged and professional, with 20 years of banking experience. Mrs. Miller's financial management has been exemplary, Klein stated. She pays bills on time, maintains adequate balances, and makes prudent decisions. Her recent decision to cancel automatic payments was completely appropriate given her circumstances. What circumstances? Weber asked. She was being financially exploited by family members. Her actions were protective and wise. Harrison tried to suggest that elderly people often made poor financial decisions, but Klein was unshakable. Mrs. Miller demonstrated better financial judgment than most customers half her age. Weber then called character witnesses. 3 women from Ruth's Garden Club testified about her involvement in community activities. They described her as organized, thoughtful, and mentally sharp. Mrs. Chen, Ruth's neighbor for 15 years, spoke about Ruth's daily routines. She tends her garden every morning. She reads books from the library. She helps other seniors with their grocery shopping. There's nothing confused about Ruth Miller. The courtroom atmosphere shifted with each witness. Harrison's confident opening had given way to defensive objections. Max stared at his hands. Lena checked her phone repeatedly. Judge Holbrook's attention focused completely on the defense case. She asked detailed questions about the financial exploitation. She reviewed the security footage twice. Finally, Weber called Ruth to testify. Ruth walked to the witness stand with steady steps. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Her voice was clear and strong. Weber guided her through the chronology. The $33,000 in payments, the power of attorney ambush, the false social services report, the harassment and intimidation. Mrs. Miller, why did you cancel the automatic payments to your son? Ruth looked directly at Judge Holbrook. Because I realized they had turned love into a business transaction, and I decided to close that account. The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment. Weber continued. Do you love your son, Mrs. Miller? Yes. But love doesn't mean letting people hurt you. It means teaching them to be better. Harrison cross-examined Ruth aggressively. He tried to paint her as vindictive and petty. He suggested she was punishing Max for getting married without inviting her. Ruth remained calm throughout. She answered each question directly and honestly. She never raised her voice or showed anger. Mr. Harrison, I'm not angry about the wedding. I'm disappointed that they used my love to fund their lives while excluding me from their happiness. When Harrison pressed her about family loyalty, Ruth's response was measured and clear. Family loyalty works both ways. I was loyal for 3 years. I supported them financially and emotionally, but they were only loyal to my checkbook. Harrison had no effective response. His questions became repetitive and desperate. Judge Holbrook called for a recess to review the evidence. Ruth returned to her seat beside Weber. For the first time in months, she felt completely calm. Across the aisle, Max and Lena whispered urgently with Harrison. Their confident posture had collapsed. Lena's hands shook as she reached for her water glass. Max avoided looking in Ruth's direction. The tables had turned completely. Truth had documentation. Lies only had drama. Weber squeezed Ruth's hand gently. You did beautifully. Ruth nodded. She had told her story clearly and completely. The evidence spoke for itself. Now justice would decide. The courtroom waited in tense silence for Judge Holbrook's return. Judge Holbrook returned to the bench after 45 minutes. The courtroom had remained silent during her absence. Ruth sat with her hands folded, watching dust motes drift through afternoon sunlight streaming from high windows. The judge's footsteps echoed against wooden floors as she approached her seat. She carried a thick folder of evidence and a single typed page. Her expression remained neutral, professional. The court has reviewed all testimony and evidence presented, Judge Holbrook began. Her voice filled the small courtroom with authority. This petition concerns the alleged incapacity of Ruth Miller to manage her personal and financial affairs. Ruth felt her heartbeat in her throat, but her hands remained steady. The petitioners have failed to provide credible evidence of incapacity, the judge continued. In fact, the evidence demonstrates that Mrs. Miller exercised sound judgment in protecting herself from financial exploitation. Weber squeezed Ruth's arm gently. Across the aisle, Max's face went pale. The court finds that this petition was motivated by financial gain rather than genuine concern for Mrs. Miller's welfare. The petition for guardianship is hereby denied. Ruth felt air rush back into her lungs. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Judge Holbrook wasn't finished. Furthermore, the court grants a protective order prohibiting the petitioners from contacting Mrs. Miller without her written consent. They are also ordered to pay 50% of her legal costs. Harrison whispered urgently to Max and Lena. Both looked stunned. Lena's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the shock in her eyes. Mrs. Miller, you are free to manage your affairs as you see fit, Judge Holbrook concluded. This court finds you fully competent and capable. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. Ruth stood slowly. Her legs felt weak, but her spirit felt strong. Weber shook her hand with genuine warmth. Congratulations, Mrs. Miller. You won more than a legal case today. Ruth nodded. She understood what he meant. She'd won back her dignity, her independence, her right to make her own choices. Max approached as Ruth gathered her purse and defense notebook. His face was flushed with embarrassment and desperation. Mom, please. Can we talk? Ruth looked at her son. She saw the little boy who had once run to her with scraped knees. But she also saw the man who had tried to steal her freedom. Not here, Max. Then where? When? Ruth considered his question carefully. When you and Lena are both employed and contributing to society instead of taking from it, and when you've completed family counseling to understand what you did wrong. Max's mouth opened, then closed. He had no immediate response. Lena stepped forward. Her mask of concerned sweetness had cracked completely. Underneath was something harder, more calculating. Mrs. Miller, we're family. Family forgives and forgets. Ruth met Lena's gaze directly. Family runs on respect, not withdrawals. And you've overdrawn that account. Lena's face flushed red. For a moment, Ruth thought she might argue further. Instead, Lena turned and walked toward the exit without another word. Max followed her, pausing at the courtroom door. Mom, I'm sorry. Ruth nodded. I know you are, Max. But sorry doesn't repair the damage you've done. Actions do. The courtroom emptied gradually. Ruth remained seated, absorbing the silence and the victory. Weber finished organizing his papers and joined her. How do you feel? Ruth considered the question. Free. And a little scared. Scared? I've been taking care of other people my whole life. First Robert, then Max. I'm not sure I remember how to take care of just myself. Weber smiled. You've been doing it for weeks now. And doing it very well. Ruth walked down the courthouse steps into late afternoon sunshine. The air smelled like autumn leaves and car exhaust and possibility. She took a deep breath and held it. For the first time in 3 years, she exhaled without guilt. Weber drove Ruth to Community Trust Bank. They updated her will to exclude anyone who had attempted financial exploitation. They added dual verification requirements to all account changes. 2 forms of identification. Written confirmation of any large withdrawals. Your money is safe now, the bank manager assured her. No one can access it without your explicit written permission. Ruth felt another layer of protection settle around her life. The locksmith came to Ruth's house that evening. Garcia was the same man who had installed the new deadbolts weeks earlier. He worked efficiently, replacing every lock on her doors and windows. "You want the old keys destroyed?" he asked. "Every one of them." Ruth watched the key-cutting machine grind the metal to dust. Max and Lena would never enter her home uninvited again. That night, Ruth sat in her living room with a cup of tea. The house felt different now. Secure. Peaceful. Truly hers for the first time in years. She looked at the photograph of Robert on the side table. His smile seemed proud and approving. "We did it," she whispered to the empty room. "We protected our home." Ruth's phone buzzed with a text message. Weber was checking on her. The protective order was already filed. Court costs would be collected automatically from Max and Lena's bank accounts. Ruth typed back a simple response. "Thank you for giving me my life back." She turned off her phone and opened a new mystery novel from the library. The story involved an elderly woman solving a decades-old murder case. Fiction about strong older women didn't seem so impossible anymore. Outside, streetlights flickered on in the gathering darkness. Ruth's reflection appeared in the living room window. The same tired face as always. But the eyes held something new. Peace without apology. Ruth Miller had learned to distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between guilt and responsibility, between love and manipulation. She had drawn boundaries and enforced them. She had protected herself without harming others. She had chosen dignity over desperation. The future stretched ahead like an unopened book. Ruth didn't know what stories it would contain, but she knew who would be writing them. Herself. Spring arrived early in Chicago. Ruth stood in her new apartment, watching Lake Michigan stretch toward the horizon. The water was gray-blue under cloudy skies. Seagulls called from somewhere beyond her view. She'd sold the Milwaukee house in March. The realtor had been surprised by her decisiveness. No sentimental delays. No second-guessing. Just a clean sale to a young couple with twin babies. Ruth used the proceeds to buy a one-bedroom lakefront apartment. Bright windows faced east toward the water. Its small balcony held 2 chairs and a row of herb plants. Everything she needed. Nothing she didn't. The apartment smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Ruth had chosen light colors for the walls. Cream and pale yellow. Colors that welcomed sunlight instead of hiding from it. On Tuesday mornings, Ruth attended watercolor classes at the community center. She painted simple landscapes and still lifes. Her brushstrokes were careful and deliberate. She was learning that mistakes could become happy accidents. Eleanor Morrison lived across the hall. She was 73 and had silver hair that caught light like spun silk. Eleanor had knocked on Ruth's door the first week with homemade cookies and an invitation to join the building's garden club. "We grow vegetables on the roof," Eleanor had explained. "Tomatoes, peppers, herbs. Everything tastes better when you grow it yourself." Ruth had accepted immediately. She'd forgotten how much she enjoyed working with soil and seeds. How satisfying it felt to nurture something and watch it grow. Wednesday afternoons were for volunteering at the Literacy Center. Ruth helped adults learn to read. Many were immigrants struggling with English. Others had simply fallen through educational cracks earlier in life. Ruth found patience she didn't know she possessed. She celebrated small victories. A man named Carlos read his first complete sentence. A woman named Maria wrote her name in perfect cursive. Progress measured in letters and words and growing confidence. For the first time in decades, every dollar Ruth spent benefited herself. Watercolor supplies, fresh flowers for her kitchen table, a comfortable reading chair by the living room window. Small luxuries that felt revolutionary after years of funding other people's lives. Summer passed quietly. Ruth developed routines that pleased her. Morning coffee on the balcony. Afternoon walks along the lakefront path. Evening reading in her new chair. She made friends gradually. Eleanor introduced her to other building residents. The watercolor class included women her age who shared similar stories. Divorce, widowhood, adult children who had disappointed them. Ruth listened to their experiences without judgment. She shared her own story when asked, but she didn't dwell on the past. The future held more interest now. Thanksgiving arrived with gray skies and early snow. Ruth cooked a small turkey breast for herself. She set her table with good china and cloth napkins. She lit candles and played classical music. The meal was simple but complete. Roasted vegetables from the roof garden. Cranberry sauce from a recipe Eleanor had shared. Pie from the bakery downstairs. Ruth ate slowly and savored each bite. She wasn't lonely. She was alone by choice. There was dignity in that distinction. After dinner, Ruth wrote a card to Max. She chose her words carefully. I hope you're well. My door is open to respect. Love, Mom. She didn't include her new address. That information would come later if and when Max earned it. Ruth never heard from Lena. She hadn't expected to. Some bridges burned completely. Others could be rebuilt with time and genuine effort. December brought Christmas lights and cold winds off the lake. Ruth decorated her apartment simply. A small tree on the side table, white lights around the windows, evergreen garland that smelled like childhood memories. Eleanor invited Ruth to Christmas dinner with her family. Ruth accepted gratefully. The evening was warm and chaotic, filled with children's laughter and multiple conversations. Ruth felt welcomed, but not desperate for belonging. She could enjoy company and then return to her own peaceful space. One evening in January, Ruth stood before her bathroom mirror. She studied her reflection with honest eyes. Her hair was lighter now. She'd asked the stylist to add silver highlights instead of covering the gray. Her face showed lines earned through 7 decades of living. But her eyes were different, steadier, clearer, no longer clouded by guilt or desperation for approval. You're enough, Ruth whispered to her reflection. You've always been enough. The words felt true in a way they never had before. In February, Ruth made a decision that surprised even herself. She donated $15,000 to the Elder Abuse Prevention Foundation. Half the money Max and Lena had taken from her. Weber helped her set up the donation. They established a small scholarship fund for seniors seeking legal protection from financial exploitation. Other people shouldn't have to fight this battle alone, Ruth told him. Money has power. It should be used to help people, not hurt them. Weber smiled with genuine respect. You've turned your experience into something meaningful. Spring returned to Chicago with warmth and longer days. Ruth stood on her balcony watering the herb plants Eleanor had helped her start. Basil and rosemary, thyme and oregano, green shoots reaching towards sunlight. The lake stretched endlessly beyond her view. Water the color of hope and possibility. Seagulls called in the distance. Children played on the beach below. Ruth felt sunlight warm her hands as she tended her plants. The simple act of nurturing growth felt profound after years of having her own growth stunted. She had learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between giving from abundance and giving from fear, between love that demanded and love that honored. Ruth Miller had found her way home to herself. The afternoon light painted everything golden, including